Hey guys, in honor of the fact that Marty McFly traveled to the future today, which is now October
21st,
yes.
2015. Where's my hoverboard?
Exactly. So in honor of all of that, we are going to do a countdown of the best time travel movies of all time.
Of all time.
Yes.
Ding. Yeah, these aren't in any particular order, and they're just sort of our opinion.
Yeah.
And also, it was hard coming up with an actual definition
of what time travel. Yeah, but we'll get to that.
Yeah.
We have a lot of honorable mentions at the end of this, but of course, if we missed anything, please leave it in the comments below. But let's get started.
Yeah, so the first movie we're gonna kick it off with is Primer. It's probably the least mainstream out of this list, but it's also probably the most scientifically plausible, if you can really say that about any of them.
Yeah. The film is hard to explain, but it's basically about four friends that become obsessed with a machine they've created in a garage. Now, the movie never explicitly calls it a time machine and barely, if at all, explains what the characters are doing, but seeing four geniuses working on a real-life, quote, time machine is fascinating to watch.
Yeah, and to ratchet up the difficulty of viewing this movie even more, the film is not told in a straight line. It's told completely non-sequentially, so some scenes are the past and some are the future. There's really no way of knowing for sure what time you're in.
Yeah.
It's definitely a movie that you'll have to watch multiple times to fully comprehend, or download, there's a very handy infographic, and by handy I mean it's fucking huge and you can't, it still doesn't help at all.
So we can't recommend this movie to all of you, but if you're looking for a time travel movie that's somewhat grounded in reality, you won't find anything more grounded than Primer. So that's a good one to kick it off with. The realistic one, sort of.
On the opposite end of the spectrum, Hot Tub Time Machine.
Yeah.
Back in 2010, this was released with just a ridiculous premise, ridiculous title. It starred John Cusack, Rob Corddry, Craig Robinson, and Clark Duke. And the result was a movie that
I liked it. I thought it was pretty good. I mean, their lives are all falling apart in the present, and they're all shadows of their former badass 1980s selves, including Clark Duke's character, who will no doubt end up just like them if he continues on his path of being a loner. So they all pack up and head out to their favorite spot from when they were young, a ski resort named Kodiak Valley, where they get a cabin and then inadvertently spill a can of Russian energy drink into the hot tub that they were enjoying, and then the controls go haywire, obviously.
So of course, they're transported back to 1986, where they all get a second chance, but are justifiably worried that if they change anything, it could have disastrous effects on the future. Eventually, they have to get back, but Rob Corddry sticks behind and changes everything, seemingly for the better thanks to his knowledge of the future.
Yeah, this movie's great because it's a very comedic yet realistic sort of portrayal of how someone would probably act if they were sent back in time, and there would be for sure someone who messes with their own personal timeline for their own personal gain. I mean, plus it's a great comedy. It's a shame that the 2015 sequel didn't really live up to its predecessor, but hey, no one can predict the future, right?
Ding. Let's move on to Austin Powers, The Spy Who Shagged Me. That's the full title. It's the James Bond parody, which co-starred friend of the show Vern Troyer, and it's definitely on this list because who could forget Mike Myers and his trip back to the 1960s?
Why was he going back to the 1960s, you might ask? Well, to retrieve his stolen mojo, of course, because without it, who would have sex with him?
Yeah, I know, look at him. So yeah, this movie would probably get panned in 2015 for being extremely offensive to women, fat people, British people, Scottish people, and megalomaniacal supervillains. But who cares? It already exists, and there's nothing you or the mainstream media can do about it.
Yeah, this movie works out the comedy in pretty much every 1960s trope you could imagine, and it's not only a parody of the British lifestyle back then, but also a time capsule of over-the-top 90s comedy as well. They really don't make them like they used to, but you know, people will always say that. This movie is great.
It was a phenomenon when it came out.
Yeah, every single person saw this movie. Yeah.
Now let's go a little more recent with XMen Days of Future Past, which is probably the most recent film on this list. This is the one where Kitty Pryde sends Wolverine back to the 1970s in order to stop Mystique from assassinating Dr. Trask. He also meets up with Charles, Professor X, Xavier, Beast, and Quicksilver in this incredibly well done time period.
It's also great because aside from everything else that Nixon was guilty of during his presidency in real life, he's also now pegged in the Marvel Cinematic Universe as the president who approved Trask's Sentinel program.
Damn it, Nick.
Way to go, Dick.
Yeah, Dick. Yeah, it was really cool to see the X-Men in this scenario. It was also obviously very entertaining to watch for everyone else who saw it too, because it pulled in about $750 million in the box office, and in at least my opinion, is by far the best X-Men movie out of all of them.
Yep.
Kind of isn't hard to do either.
Yeah. Lifting an entire stadium up off the ground is just very impressive.
Michael Fassbender.
Yeah. Moving on to 12 Monkeys. Terry Gilliam is known for making some pretty weird movies, and 12 Monkeys is definitely weird. Bruce Willis stars as a prisoner living in the year 2027, 31 years after a deadly virus wiped out most of humanity and forced the remaining survivors to live underground.
He gets selected for a mission that sends him back in time to collect information on that virus so that the scientists in 2027 can figure out a cure.
He gets sent back to 1990, and it's so different than what he's used to that he freaks the hell out and gets arrested and sent to an insane asylum, where he meets a young, totally insane Brad Pitt, who's also been institutionalized.
12 Monkeys does a great job of showing just how difficult and frustrating it would be to go back in time and get anyone to believe anything you tell them, even if it's the truth and you're actually trying to help them. Probably get sent into an insane asylum.
Yeah, exactly. Next up, Army of Darkness. Now, Army of Darkness was the point where Sam Raimi just threw his hands in the air and let the Evil Dead movies become self-aware as just straight-up slapstick comedy.
Yeah, whereas the previous two were somewhat generous attempts at the genre, which through one way or another came out to be shockingly hilarious at points, Army of Darkness set out for laughs on purpose.
Yeah, Bruce Campbell, aka Ash, gets sucked through a time portal in this movie and lands back in medieval times where he's captured and enslaved because they think he's working for a rival duke.
Yeah, he gets thrown in a pit and defeats a Deadite after getting back his trusty chainsaw arm, and then he takes control over his situation with his futuristic weapons, mainly his boomstick.
This is my boomstick. Now, the only way he can get back to modern day is by, yep, you guessed it, finding a Necronomicon and reading from it. Along the way, he battles every type of medieval undead trope you could think of and awakens the literal Army of Darkness.
This movie is a ton of fun because, like a lot of these time travel movies, it's basically a fish out of water type story, but rarely do we get to see it through the scope of horror, and in this specific case, horror comedy. It's also just a breeding ground for some of Bruce Campbell's most memorable moments and famous lines.
Yeah. All right, a lot of people are gonna give me shit for this next one, but I put this one in here to mess with you, and it's Black Knight, because although Martin Lawrence does go back to medieval times in this movie, technically he just drowns, goes into a coma, and is probably dreaming this whole thing.
Oh, he doesn't actually go back in time?
But this movie is a textbook example of Martin Lawrence comedy from his from his prime?
He had a prime.
He had a prime.
It's so dumb. It'll no doubt become a cult classic to someone somewhere.
Me, specifically.
Yeah. So basically, Martin Lawrence, who works at a theme park called Medieval World, goes back in time, but he thinks that he's just down the street at another competing theme park called Castle World.
Yeah.
So he just treats everyone as if they're still in modern times.
Yeah.
Joke's on him, though, because he's actually in medieval times.
Yeah, it sounds confusing. I swear to God, it's not. When you watch it, you'll get it. It's sort of like Army of Darkness without all the undead, and with Martin Lawrence instead of Bruce Campbell. Honestly, if you've got 90 minutes to kill, I mean, give this one a shot, but remember, it is really, really stupid, and you'll probably hate it.
Perfect.
It is just, I was at the perfect time, perfect age, perfect sense of humor for this
The Black Knight.
amazing Martin Lawrence comedy.
Wow.
Yeah, he bangs the king's daughter, and he's like, I wasn't the first one. Is a great joke in the thing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Anyways,
Classic.
let's move on to a serious movie.
Yeah, next up is Looper. Bruce Willis is the star of yet another great time travel on this list. Rian Johnson's Looper, which is real hard to explain, but here you go. In the year 2074, time travel is invented and then quickly made illegal. But criminals still use it to send people into the past in order to have those people killed and then have their bodies disposed of by people called loopers, who are called that because in exchange for large sums of money, they too will have to eventually be sent back in time to be killed by their younger selves, which closes the loop.
Yeah, Joseph Gordon-Levitt plays a looper named Joe, and when his older self, played by Bruce Willis, gets sent back, old Joe manages to escape being killed, and then goes on a warpath trying to find and kill the man responsible for his wife's murder, who at this point is just a baby.
Yeah, so it's Bruce Willis versus a younger version of himself. Oh, and there's also telekinesis in this movie.
Mm-hmm.
At some point in the future, I guess people start being able to develop telekinetic abilities, and some of them do so to a really terrifying degree. That's all I'm going to say about that, because it's probably the best moment in the movie.
Yeah.
But it's very badass.
Anyways, this movie, especially when you're talking about it, doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it's a really, really fun ride. And it's like all of these time travel movies, they all sound so crazy when you're jumping around in all the time and trying to explain it in words. When you actually watch them, it makes a lot more sense.
Looper's one where I definitely had to turn off the logic part of my brain and just be like, it just accepts these are the rules. They don't make any sense, but sure.
Well, turn that logic back on, because up next we're talking about Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Yes, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure was arguably my first true favorite time travel movie. Yes, another one that we're going to mention later was released well before this, but I was too young to truly grasp the incredible minutia that went into that movie. Whereas, Bill and Ted's was a totally radical blast of a movie and also paved the way for Keanu Reeves to be the national treasure he is today.
Wow.
Yeah.
The time machine in this one is a telephone booth, and the goal is to ace their history class presentation so that Ted's dad won't ship him off to military school, thus breaking up their band, the Wild Stallions, which would then ruin the future where they basically save humanity.
Exactly. George Carlin, aka Rufus, shows up and convinces them to use the time machine to gather up historical figures and bring them into the present day so they can accurately find out what all these important people would think about San Dimas, California in 1988.
It's just a ton of fun because aside from the fact that they travel back in time to retrieve these people, the real enjoyment comes of seeing these major players from throughout history running wild in 1988. You got Napoleon scarfing down ice cream and going to a water park, and the rest of the characters mostly just causing mayhem at a local shopping mall.
Beethoven playing the electric piano.
Yeah.
And, yeah. Genghis Khan goes in a sports store.
Oh yeah.
The whole thing's great. When it comes down to it, Bill and Ted obviously aced their presentation, and the Wild Stallions are safe to rule again in the future. Once more.
Yeah.
Yep. It's a great movie. I love this movie.
Yeah, and just around that same time,
Yeah.
maybe a few years later,
Another really important movie.
Terminator 2 Judgment Day.
Woo!
It's like not only probably the best action movie of all time, it's also one of the best time travel movies ever as well. It's written and produced by James Cameron, starring Arnold, Linda Hamilton, and Robert Patrick, and then Edward Furlong. He plays the young John Connor.
Yeah.
It's a badass movie. It's all over the place time-wise. It's just
Specifically for the Terminators,
Yeah.
After being committed to a mental hospital for attempting to bomb a computer factory, Sarah Connor can no longer prepare young John Connor for his future role as the leader of the human resistance against Skynet.
Skynet sends a T-1000 back in time to the present to kill John before he has a chance to grow up and take on the role. But also in the future, John Connor has programmed a T-800 Terminator, aka Arnold, and he sends that back in time to protect himself from the other Terminator.
Yes. The T-1000, despite also being more advanced than the T-800, was also insanely advanced for CGI back in 1991 when this movie was released, and has honestly itself stood the test of time, along with pretty much every other aspect of this amazing, amazing action movie.
You can thank Stan Winston for
Yeah.
It's a great mix of CGI and practical effects.
Exactly.
The time travel in this film, aside from the brief shots of the dystopian future, is pretty much limited to two robots coming from the future to the past and turning our present day into a battleground, but still, technically, we're dealing with some pretty heavy time travel in this movie. So, screw you.
Yeah.
We're leaving it in.
All right, so that brings us to the movie that we basically based this entire list off of because of the day that it is. Or movies, I should say, because it's the trilogy, Back to the Future 1, 2, and 3.
Yep, it's the one we've all been waiting for, and the series that'll go down in history is probably the greatest nod to time travel there's ever been. Back to the Future, baby.
Yeah, everyone knows these movies and pretty much everyone loves them. You know the story too. Marty McFly accidentally travels back in time in Doc Brown's DeLorean after the Libyans come after him and accidentally makes his mom fall in love with him instead of his dad, George McFly. And he must, through any means possible, get them back together or it will mean that he and his family members never existed at all.
I always forget just how much incest is the theme of this
Yeah.
movie. Anyway, just seeing how someone from the present, or at least the 1985 present, would react to traveling 30 years back to a time that's not that distant, and seeing exactly how his parents lived is pretty interesting and makes for some really awkward and hilarious situations.
Yeah. Now it should be obvious right now, but the same amount of time has passed from this movie being released to now as time passed from the point they go back to the release of the movie. It's strange to
30
comprehend.
years, yeah.
So as crazy as the 1950s look, like how in the past that looked to 1985, is technically how 1985 should look to us now.
It's very old.
It's true, but I don't know. Anyways, that's just the first one. And yes, the first film in the franchise is the masterpiece. The other ones can hardly compare to the absolute lightning in a bottle that they captured in the original film. But that doesn't stop part 2 from being a damn blast as well.
Yeah, part 2 is the one where they actually go to the future because he has to save his kids, blah, blah. Wait, who cares?
We all know it.
Has been and will continue to be the predictions that they made about the future, which we are all currently living in. Flying cars? Nope. Hoverboards? Nope.
Sort of.
Cubs winning the World Series?
Maybe.
Maybe. Even the bad version of the future where Biff Tannen runs everything like a megalomaniacal version of Donald Trump. The best part of number 2 is getting a glimpse at what people thought the not too distant future was going to be like, and then now we're living to that point to see that, a lot more seems to have changed between the 50s and the 80s than from the 80s to the 2010s. Except, you know, computers and smartphones.
Cell phones, yeah. We've had a lot of technological advancement where I think is the 50s to the 80s was like societal advancement.
Yeah.
And we did go to the fucking moon in between 55 and 85.
True.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, I guess we've landed stuff on Mars.
Yeah.
We're all doing great. That's the point. Anyways, number 3 is just fine on its own, and we're not trying to slight it in any way, but at its core, it's just a comedy western with their main concern being that Marty needs to get back to the present, but figuring out how they can do that before the technology for combustion engines in automobiles actually exists. It's a fine movie, but it really nothing can compare to the first two.
Too much Doc Brown love story. Then.
Yeah. So this one's all about Doc Brown.
Yeah.
Anyways, we do have some runners up, and we had to cut all of these because we got into a huge
argument debate about whether like movies that involve cryogenics count as time travel.
So my
if your
point-
body never tried.
So my point is, a lot of the people made the point online of saying that, like, yeah, well then everyone's time traveling when they sleep. My point is if you stay the same age and physical appearance, then you're technically time traveling. If you age, then it's different. Like, for example, Demolition Man, Encino Man, Idiocracy, all cryogenically frozen. They do not age. They are the same person. They wake up in a new time. That is that I consider that a time travel movie.
It transports the viewer to a new time.
And the person, he hasn't aged. He closes his eyes, he wakes up 30 or 40 or 50 or 100 years in the future.
He was just asleep. It was a nap.
It's not a nap. He didn't age. If he was Rip Van Winkle, he's growing a beard, he's aging.
Kill Bill, that's not even cryogenics. He was just in a coma.
Yeah, well, no,
not time
I just
travel.
put it in there to argue with you about it.
Yeah, literally any movie, like,
he shut his eyes.
Time traveling.
The next day.
Time didn't stop.
Anyways, I think that if you travel more than 10 years and you don't age, and it happens for you, and you just wake up in this time period, it's time travel.
Okay, but then there's also movies like Groundhog Day and Edge of Tomorrow. Are those time travel movies? Time looping?
Time looping is time travel. They get to live the day over.
Yeah.
It's just the one day.
I don't know.
Anyways, you guys argue about it in the comments and let us know who's right and who's wrong, or if we're both wrong, or if we're both right, or whatever. It doesn't matter. Enjoy these time travel movies, and happy Marty McFly Day or whatever.
Yeah. Now shut up about the hoverboards.
Yeah.